Hello, I'm Barry Daniel, and this is the podcast of the Middle Way Society. Our aim is to encourage a universal approach to living a more integrated, ethical life, avoiding dogma or any appeal to authority. My guest today is Evan Thompson, Professor of Philosophy at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver and an expert in the fields of cognitive science, philosophy of mind, phenomenology and cross-cultural philosophy, especially Buddhist philosophy in dialogue with Western philosophy and science. He co-wrote the groundbreaking The Embodied Mind with Francisco Varela and Eleanor Rosch, which was arguably the first book to explore the relationship between Buddhist philosophy and cognitive science. He's also the author of Colour Vision and Mind in Life. He's here to talk to us today about his latest book, Waking, Dreaming, Being, Self and Consciousness in Neuroscience, Meditation and Philosophy, and how this might relate to the Middle Way. Hello, Evan. Welcome to the Middle Way Society podcast.
Thank you. Thanks for having me join you.
Okay, well, could we begin by you telling us a little bit about your background, Evan, and in what way that has contributed to your work that arguably to a large extent appears to be an attempt to synthesize many of the more fruitful perspectives of the contemplative traditions and cognitive science?
Yes, well, the book really grows out of my personal history going back to when I was a kid and a teenager. I was raised in an institute and community that my father, William Irwin Thompson, founded in the 1970s, and the community was called the Lindisfarne Association. And he started this institute community. He was a university professor. He left the university feeling at the time that the universities really weren't creating the kinds of knowledge that society needed. And so he started this alternative organization that brought together contemplative teachers, spiritual religious teachers, and scientists and philosophers and poets and artists, ecologists, political activists. And so this was the milieu in which I grew up, in which there was always an ongoing exchange, dialogue, debate between especially science and contemplative spirituality, you could say.
Yeah.
So growing up in this environment, I was always very kind of gripped by the philosophical questions that were at play in these discussions. And so when I went away to university, I first studied Asian studies as an undergraduate, studied Asian philosophy, especially Buddhist philosophy, Chinese language, Chinese history, and then decided that I wanted to continue in graduate school in philosophy, get my PhD in philosophy. And during my time in graduate school, I also started working with a neuroscientist named Francisco Varela, whom I had met through my father at the Lindisfarne Association. And he was a very pioneering neuroscientist as a scientist, but also in really beginning the dialogue between contemporary mind-brain sciences and Buddhist philosophy and Buddhist thought. He was involved in creating the Mind and Life Institute, which has brought together scientists with the Dalai Lama for many discussions about Buddhist thought and practice. So we worked together for a number of years, eventually writing The Embodied Mind. So my whole background intellectually, but also personally, has always been concerned with issues about the nature of the mind seen from these different perspectives, the perspective of contemplative practice and contemplative philosophy, especially Buddhist philosophy or Indian philosophy more generally, we could say, and then the modern brain sciences, cognitive science, and the role that philosophy plays in cognitive science. And so the book Waking, Dreaming, Being grows out of that concern over many, many years.
And would you say you're more a philosopher or more a scientist, or are they inextricably linked? You can't really separate them?
I would say I'm first and foremost a philosopher, but I'm a philosopher who works a lot in collaboration with scientists. So collaboration both in theoretical modeling kinds of work, but also I've done collaborative work that's experimental work on various aspects of cognition studied from the perspective of neuroscience. So although I'm not a trained scientist in the sense that I'm not an experimentalist, I don't have a lab, I am in that sense first and foremost a philosopher, and my interests are primarily philosophical. I feel that it's important as a philosopher of mind to work in close collaboration with scientists, and especially in my case with neuroscientists. So I've done a lot of that work over the years as well.
Okay, and with the advances in neuroscience and psychology in the last 30 years or so, would you say that the division between these disciplines and philosophy has become ever more blurred?
I would say so, yes, in a number of ways. I would say especially in the field of cognitive science. Cognitive science has always, from its inception, conceived of itself as a very interdisciplinary project. In many ways, it's the most successful interdisciplinary project because it includes psychology and linguistics and neuroscience and computer science and artificial intelligence, and always philosophy. Philosophy has always played a very strong role. So although you can still do philosophy in a traditional way if you like, and just do historical textual study of ancient or modern philosophy, or just do philosophy in a more abstract way disconnected from science, the kind of philosophy that goes on in cognitive science is very much an interdisciplinary project where the lines are really blurred between these different disciplines, and that's the kind of work that I try to do.
Sure. Okay. Well, let's jump in and have a look at the book. What motivated you to write it, and what do you think is the fundamental question in it that you pose?
Well, I'd say the fundamental question is the question about what is consciousness, what is the nature of consciousness, how is it related to the brain and the body, and the motivation for writing it and for kind of confronting that question head on was, again, going back to my background, having been raised in a context, especially as a kid, where the contemplative perspective was very much paramount, and a certain view of consciousness went along with that, a view of consciousness as transcending the brain, as fundamental to the nature of reality. And of course, that view, as I went into the study of philosophy of mind and cognitive science, came under a fair amount of pressure, because that's not the view that you would find in your average neuroscientist. So the motivation on a personal level was to kind of grapple with these differences between, let's call it, a kind of spiritualist worldview and a materialist worldview. Yes. And for me, that really was anchored on this question about the nature of consciousness. So that's what the book tries to address, is what is consciousness, how is it related to our sense of self, and in a way that draws on the contemplative perspective and the scientific perspective at the same time.
So, well, how did you divide it up, the book, Evan?
So what I did is given this kind of overarching question about what is consciousness, how is it related to our sense of self, I then went back to the very earliest account in recorded history of the nature of consciousness, which comes from the ancient Indian text of the Upanishads, where there's a map presented of consciousness as including consciousness in being awake, consciousness in dreaming, consciousness in deep sleep, and then eventually a fourth is added, which is a kind of pure consciousness, a kind of pure awareness. And I use that structure to organize the progression of the chapters, where I begin with consciousness in the waking state. So I examine their things like perception, mind wandering. Then I look at what happens to consciousness and the sense of self as we start to fall asleep. Then I examine dreaming. I examine what happens when sometimes we become aware that we're dreaming, so lucid dreaming. I examine the question of what happens to consciousness in deep sleep, where that means dreamless sleep. And I look at what happens to consciousness during the dissolution process of the mind in dying and in death. And I also look at consciousness in the context of out-of-body experiences. So the basic idea there was that across this range of different states of consciousness, that our awareness is changing, what we are aware of, the contents of awareness is changing, and the sense of self in these states is also changing. And so that gave me the structure for drawing from neuroscience and Western philosophy and Indian philosophy, Buddhist and non-Buddhist, to examine or to explore consciousness and the sense of self across this spectrum of states of awareness.
Could we then just unpack this a little bit? So let's start off with the waking state. What comprises that? How does it alternate, for example?
Right. So in the waking state, consciousness is very much anchored to a sense of being embodied, bodily presence in the world, and so that's perceptual. And attention typically jumps from one thing to the next. So you something grabs your visual attention, or you hear a sound, or you get caught up in a thought. So there's a distinctly mental form of attention. And what often happens there is if we start to daydream, or our minds start to wander, is that another kind of sense of self comes into play, which is a narrative or autobiographical sense of self. Because when we mind wander, typically the thoughts that are coming up for us are memories from the past in which there's some image of ourself, or with a similar type of image, we're projecting into the future and rehearsing or imagining something that we're going to do later in the day or next week. So when we get caught up in a train of thought in that way, the sense of self is enlarged beyond just the bodily sense of self in the present moment, but includes a narrative, distinctly mental sense of self, because it's made up of mental images. And the content of the thought, especially the emotional content of a sense of, I was happy a few months ago when I was on vacation, or I'm really looking forward to the trip that I'm going to take next week. Yeah. Those thoughts have an emotional content, and we have an image of ourself in the thought, and we identify with that image as self. There's what I call a self-identification process at work, where in one sense, it's just a thought. It's just a mental content. But we immediately feel that thought as a representation of me, yeah, or as I, and we appropriate that thought as my thought. This is an image of me. And that's a kind of mental representational self that's very much bound up with what psychologists call mental time travel, our ability to project ourselves into our personal past and to project ourselves forward into our anticipatory sense of what our personal future is going to be. So in the waking state, there's this dynamic alternation, you could say, between a bodily sense of self that's perceptual in the present moment, in which attention is typically jumping around, and then a mental sense of self, this autobiographical sense of self that involves time travel, that also captures our mental attention.
How can mindfulness affect these alternate states?
Well, mindfulness, so of course the word mindfulness can be used to mean different kinds of things, but if we take it in a very general sense, as always including some kind of awareness, or we could even say meta-awareness, because it's an awareness of experience itself, then there's a noting that can become possible of the fact that, as I was just saying, the thought is in a way just a thought. So we immediately feel this identification, and say in the case of depression, this can become very negative and debilitating, because we get caught up in ruminative loops of thought in which we have a certain image of ourselves. It's a negatively valenced image. Oh, I'm not successful, or oh, I'm constantly failing at what I do. And mindfulness provides a larger space in which to notice that thought has a content, as all thoughts do, but its reality is just a thought. It's not as if, for example, when you mentally imagine tasting a strawberry or tasting some chocolate, you may start salivating, so you may have a physical reaction. But then if you notice, well, it's not a real strawberry, it's not really chocolate, it's a mental representation, that enables you in a way to desolidify the thought and to realize, oh, I don't need to identify with that thought in that way. I can stand back and see it in a larger context as a mental content. Or in the case of the bodily sense of self, especially say in the context of sitting meditation, one notices that one's sensory attention jumps around, so you hear a sound, or your foot, falls asleep, or your back might be sore, or something like that. So there's this constantly changing field of sensory experiences, and your attention is typically jumping from one to the next, depending on whichever one is salient. mindfulness practice is about being able to observe that and not immediately react to it, so that if you feel a pain in your foot, you just automatically in an unthinking way have to move your foot, that you can notice that it's a sensation that you respond to in a certain way, and being able to notice that gives you a kind of freedom. It opens up more space for how you relate to it.
Can we move on to dreaming now? You divide it up into three parts in the book: the hypnagogic state, the dreaming, and lucid dreaming. Could you expand a bit on that?
So yes, I divide dreaming into these three kinds of dream states. So the first one, the hypnagogic state. Hypnagogic just means leading into sleep from the Greek words. So this is what happens when you start to fall asleep and you see certain kinds of, images play across the field of your visual awareness, or maybe you hear certain sounds, or you have peculiar kinds of thoughts. And it's a state in which attention is very much absorbed in and captured by the image or the sound or the thought, and there's kind of a dissolution of a sense of a separate self, a separate world. There's a way in which you're just absorbed in the image. It's a kind of fascinated consciousness. And in our culture, actually, so when I lecture about this or teach classes, many people say, "Oh, I never experienced that." And I think that's in large part because in our culture, we lead these stressful lives. We're very tired. So when we go to sleep, we often just kind of crash, as we say, and we sort of fall through that state very quickly. And we don't have any sort of prolonged awareness of the process leading from the waking state into sleep. Whereas in a more relaxed or in a more contemplative environment, that space opens up more, and one can observe it as it happens, because it's liminal between waking and dreaming. But the feature that marks it as different from dreaming is that it's not usually structured by a sense of being immersed in the dream world. There's a kind of dissolution of ego boundaries, to use a Freudian term, where there's not a strong sense of separation between self and world. But that sense of separation reappears often in the dream state, where there's a sense of you're in a world, you're in an environment, things are happening, you may be fully experiencing your body in that world, you have a kind of dream body. And so there's this reemergence of the sense of a bodily sense of self and a mental sense of self that we see in the waking state that reappears in dreaming. But in dreaming, it has different features from in the waking state. So for example, in dreams, emotions tend to be much more intense, and things tend to be much more unstable cognitively. So just as in the waking state, your attention jumps around, in the dream state, it really jumps around. Your attention is kind of constantly going from one dream image to the next. And in a way, the dream is just that, your attention moving in this kind of shifting, discrete way from one thing to the next. Then in a lucid dream, the possibility arises of actually knowing that you're dreaming, because typically in a dream we're not aware of the state as a dream state. We're just caught up in the dream, and we take it to be real. Then in a lucid dream, there's a realization that can happen that, oh, this is a dream. And in the case of a very intense or very lucid, you might say, dream state, that allows for the possibility of simply attending to the dream state as a dream state, with the knowledge that I am asleep in bed, this is a dream, and I can pay attention to it as a dream. Some people, especially in Western writings on lucid dreaming, they like to emphasize the idea of controlling the dream. In point of fact, sometimes you can control the dream, sometimes you can't. And control is always partial in some ways. The dream always does funny things, even in your controlling of it, typically. But what, for me, really is the crucial marker of a lucid dream is not so much any effort at control or ability at control, but rather the realization that it is a dream, that the whole state is just a content of awareness, and that you can pay attention to it in that way. So from a contemplative or meditative perspective, this allows you to be mindful of the dream as a dream, which is of course not possible in a non-lucid dream.
So is this notion of lucid dreaming a fairly recent understanding from a Western perspective?
It's recent from the point of view of sleep science, yes. So I would say that people have reported in Western culture being aware of the dream as a dream in literature and in myth and stories for hundreds of years. But when sleep science got going in the 1950s, and there was the discovery of rapid eye movement sleep, for example, and its strong association with dreaming, the general view was that lucid dreaming wasn't a real phenomenon, that what was happening when people said they were aware of dreaming while dreaming is really that they were waking up, they had a brief micro moment of being awake, then they went back into the dream, fell back asleep, so that when they woke up again, they kind of retrospectively confabulated being awake and aware of the dream, but actually they really weren't.
All right.
It was then discovered that that's not the right way to look at things. And this is actually a kind of fascinating case of methods in sleep science where they had discovered that in rapid eye movement sleep, which is strongly associated with vivid imagistic dreaming, that there was sometimes an association between the content of the dream and the way that the reported content of the dream when the person woke up and the way the eyes had been moving. So if someone said, I was dreaming of playing tennis, and watching the ball go back and forth, that in the rapid eye movement state you would see, the eyes moving back and forth. So two researchers hit upon the idea, one in England and one in the United States, hit upon the idea of, well, if people can really lucid dream, then they should be able to remember the instruction that when they're aware of dreaming to look left, look right, look left, look right. And if that corresponds with the physical eye movements, so it's the movement of the dream eyes, as it were, if that corresponds with physical eye movements, then we should be able to see that as a regular movement on the eye trace, on the trace of the eye movements. And that would give us a kind of objective, measurable verification of the lucid dream state. And that's exactly what happened. So they had people who were reliable lucid dreamers, when they realized they were dreaming, remember to look left and right in this regular way. And then upon awakening, they said, I was aware that I was dreaming. I looked left, looked right. And yes, there it is on the eye trace when the scientists would go and look at it, that the eyes had moved that way. So this has become the method now that people use when they want to study lucid dreaming in the context of brain imaging experiments or electrophysiological experiments. And this is very new. I mean, this is late 70s that this first was done. And then in the past just 5 years, people have taken this method and used it in the context of having people sleep in the brain scanner so they can see what's going on in the brain in the case of lucid dreaming, compared to being awake or compared to ordinary dreaming. So that's all very recent from the Western perspective. Now, from the Tibetan Buddhist perspective, there's been a long-standing practice of using lucid dreaming as a special context in which to practice meditation. And that's precisely because emotions are very intense in lucid dreams, so it gives you a way of developing, let's call it mindfulness of emotions, in a context where emotions are quite powerful and gripping. And it also helps you to realize that consciousness kind of constructs realities for itself, and that often involves a sense of self, but that's all a mental representation, you could say. And of course, one could realize that in principle in the waking meditation as well, but it's especially compelling in the case of dreaming. So the Tibetan practice of dream yoga is a practice in which lucid dreaming and meditation are put together. They're harnessed, you could say, for the purpose of transforming negative emotions and for seeing the nature of consciousness in action, you could say.
Yeah, fascinating. Okay, can you talk a little bit about field and observer states, both in dreaming and we have these in memory as well, and how that has proven fruitful to an extent for your research?
Yeah. So the field observer distinction came up first in the psychology of memory. And the idea is that if I ask you to remember something that happened to you yesterday, or I ask you to remember, what you were, your first memory of the day upon waking up, you might experience the memory in the sense of you're back in that past scene, seeing it again through your own eyes, in a first-person perspective, where you have that's the field perspective. You're back in the scene, seeing it again, as it were, reliving it from a first person perspective. That's one way the memory could happen for you. Another way that it could happen is that you have a kind of bird's eye view of yourself in memory in the past. So you think, well, what was the first thing that happened to me when I got up this morning? And you sort of you see an image of yourself in the bed from a third person outside perspective, a kind of observer perspective that's typically kind of almost like an elevated bird's eye point of view. And clearly you didn't experience waking up that way, at least not ordinarily. So that points to the way that memories are constructed and transformed from a first-person experience into either a relived first-person experience or a kind of third-person outside perspective. And that very much has to do with what we were talking about with mental time travel, where you project yourself into the past. The image that you draw up of yourself can have these different formats, and as well into the future. We know that that this can be biased in certain ways in an experimental context by the kind of questions we ask. So if we ask you, what did you feel when you first woke up in the morning? Chances are the memory will be in a first-person field format, because you're reliving the bodily sensations, the affect, the emotions you had, and that biases you towards the first-person field memory. If we ask things like, well, what color were your pajamas? Or how were the sheets arranged? Factual questions, that biases you more towards the third-person perspective. So that's in the case of memory and time travel. And that structure reappears in the dream state. So if you have a dream, you can experience the dream in an immersed way in the dream. That's the field perspective, where you're in the dream and seeing the dream world from, through your dream eyes. Or you can be in the dream world in a different way, which is you're observing it and you see yourself as a character, as it were, in the dream. So that's the observer perspective, where the whole content of your awareness, the dream is nothing but a content of your awareness, but you represent yourself as, in a way, outside it, observing something in it, or you represent yourself as fully immersed in it, experiencing it from the field perspective. So this has to do with our human sense of self, that we can actually represent ourself to ourselves from an outside perspective, which enables us to time travel mentally. It enables us to empathize with other people, because if I try to put myself in your shoes, suppose, we're having a quarrel or a disagreement, and, you say something about me, and I really don't understand. Well, how could you take what I said that way? One thing that I can do is I can put myself in your shoes to try to see from your perspective how it is that, my behavior is appearing to you. And so in doing that, I have to take an outside perspective on myself, and that's crucial for empathy and for understanding other people. So that also is another place where this shift and change in perspective comes into play.
To what extent could this also relate to phenomena like out-of-body experiences or near-death experiences?
In an out-of-body experience, so I have a chapter on this in the book, and I also talk about it in the context of near-death experiences in the chapter on dying. In out-of-body experiences, what happens is that you have, we could say, a kind of dissociation between these two senses of self that are usually integrated. So you usually experience yourself as where your body is, but in an out-of-body experience, you have this kind of outside perspective on yourself that you have in observer memory, and that you have in a dream where you see yourself from the outside. So you might, for example, if it's the kind of out-of-body experience that happens to some people in sleep, you might wake up, as it were, with the view of yourself in the bed below, and you have a sense of yourself as hovering up by the ceiling. The difference between an out-of-body experience and memory is that in an out-of-body experience, it feels very perceptual. So it feels like, in a way, it's not out of body, because you feel like you're floating at the ceiling, and floating is a bodily sensation that has to do with the vestibular sense You have a sense of gravity, you have a sense of up down, you have an egocentric sense of space, of forward and back and left and right and up and down. So that's all bodily. But that aspect of your bodily awareness is up at the ceiling, and then you see an image of your body asleep in the bed. So that's like the outside perspective in memory, except that it feels perceptual. So it's a kind of dissociative body experience. I actually think it would really be better to call those kinds of experiences not so much out-of-body experiences, but altered body or altered embodiment experiences, because it's not as if you don't experience having any body. Even if you experience yourself, some people report this, just being a kind of pure observational point in space, still that space is structured as a bodily space of, forward, backward, left, right, up, down. Those are all bodily coordinates. So the so-called out-of-body experience is in a way very bodily, but it's dissociative, where you see your body below you in the bed. And then, of course, in the context of near-death experiences, one of the so the term near-death experience covers a range of different experiential qualities and states. And one of them is that people often report out-of-body experiences, seeing themselves in the operating room, or on people trying to resuscitate them in the case of cardiac arrest experiences, and so those experiences have this structure of altered embodiment, of a sense of being able to observe yourself from outside, but in a way that is often bodily in description, because people report, being sucked back into their body, or being above it, or being able to journey away from it. And the way that that's described is very bodily, in the sense that it involves these kinds of vestibular sensations, gravity, and so forth.
Let's try to start tying all this together. I'd like to ask you what joint attention is, and how is that important in regard to our understanding of the self?
Yeah, so joint attention is something that I talk about in the very last chapter of the book, which is devoted to the nature of the self. And one of the points that I make there, and here I'm really actually drawing on the work of a psychologist named Michael Tomasello, is the idea that our sense of self, of being oneself among many others, is, from a cognitive and developmental perspective, dependent on joint attention. So what joint attention is my ability to share with you attention. That is, we're both paying attention to the conversation, or if your eyes were to go off towards something on your desk, I could follow your eyes and could understand that you were paying attention to something on the desk that I can also pay attention to. So psychologists call that joint attention, the ability to share attention. And human beings are very, very good at that. Other animals may be able to do it to varying extent, but human beings are very specialized in a way for that. Now,
so just thinking about dogs there. Dogs, I've heard, are the only animals that can follow a pointed finger. Are we sharing attention there with dogs?
Well, so ethologists debate about the extent to which dogs and also other primates like ourselves, the extent to which they're able to share attention in the ways that we do. And some argue that, yes, there is really robust shared attention, and others want to say, well, no, it's not exactly the same kind of thing. So that's a live debate that you'll get different answers to depending on who you ask. So the way that relates to the human sense of self, though, is that we know that in infancy, babies at a certain period of time develop the capacity for joint attention, usually around, let's say, 9 months, though it's a variable time window, where the baby can follow the mother or father's eyes and know that they're both paying attention to the toy, or they're both paying attention to the bottle or to the bowl of food or something like that. And eventually the baby becomes able to understand that she is the object of attention of the parent. So that means that they're sharing attention, but they're sharing attention to the self, that is, to oneself. And that implies the realization, it might not be in the form of a full-blown thought, but implicitly you could say it implies the cognitive understanding that I can be the object of attention of another, and that one can at least eventually see oneself from that other's perspective. And that's very important for developing social emotions like, well, all emotions are social, but emotions like shame and jealousy and envy, pride, these very much have to do with our understanding of how we are perceived by others. So joint attention is crucial for having that outside perspective on the self that we then are able to internalize in memory and in time travel, and also in dreams and in out-of-body experiences where there's this outside perspective on the self. So the conjecture, I suppose you could say, would be that were it not for that developmental capacity we have for joint attention, that those kinds of self-experiences, the mental time travel ones, the out-of-body ones, those wouldn't really be possible, that it requires that capacity of joint attention.
This sense of mental time travel or narrative self not only has a social aspect but a linguistic one too, doesn't it?
Yes, well, in our case, it's very much always mediated through language, through being able to refer to ourselves, represent ourselves linguistically, the structure of language with pronouns and so on, so that we have a concept of self that's very much part of the structure of language of I and you and he and she and it. And when we use a word like I or me or mine, it's not even just a pure kind of conceptual thing. It's affective and emotional. We feel that it's that the I is me in a strong affective way as well.
How do the Yogācāra and the Madhyamaka schools differ in their view of consciousness? And again, how is this important to the conclusions you draw in your book?
Yeah, so that's a in a way big and complicated question, but to simplify, we could say that for some of the Yogācāra philosophers, in particular one philosopher named Vasubandhu, very important Indian Buddhist philosopher, the idea is that really the self is a fiction, it's an illusion, in that if we use a pronoun like I, strictly speaking, it doesn't refer to anything. We feel as if it refers to a real agent of action, a real thinker of thoughts, but upon analysis, there's really just a sequence of moments in which we represent there being an I, but in fact, there really is no such thing. There's no substantial ego in that sense. And so you could say that in that view, the self is an illusion. Now, the Madhyamaka view is similar in some ways, but is arguably more sophisticated in saying, well, it is illusory in that we think there's a real substantial I, but there's also a conventional everyday functioning I that's a kind of construction, and that isn't really an illusion in quite that way. It has a kind of functional role. It plays a role in everyday life. It's also dysfunctional because we typically take it to have a reality that it doesn't have. We don't see that it's a construction. We think of it as just a kind of mirage. We think it's something real when it's actually – we think it's something real in an unconstructed sense when it's actually a construction. But in being a construction, it's not a mere mirage or illusion in quite the way that the Yogācāra say. And the reason that's important for me is because I want to use the Madhyamaka perspective to criticize a view that we see very much in neuroscience today, which says there is no self. The self is a complete illusion created by the brain. And I think the problem with that view is that it mistakenly assumes that if the self were a construction of our biology, a construction of language, a construction of our social life, that therefore it would have to be unreal. And some constructions are illusions, but not all constructions are illusions. So something can be constructed but still have a kind of reality to it as a construction. And that's what I want to argue in the cognitive science case context in the case of the self, that the self is very much a construction, not a substantial thing, but it's not right to think that it's illusory and that the brain is the fundamental reality, the constructive process has its own standing, you could say, that makes the self not a mere illusion. So I take that idea in a way from the context of Madhyamaka and the way that it, you could say, dialectically engages with the Yogācāra school in Indian philosophy. And the last chapter of the book is all about that.
And how does this all relate to the Buddhist concept of Namarupa?
Namarupa is a term. It's actually a very old Indian term, going even back into the Upanishads. But in the Buddhist context, it means different things. But in its earliest meaning, I suppose you could say the idea is that, so rupa means form. So it's the idea of something physically or materially having a certain form or shape. And nama means name. So it's the idea that if something has a kind of individual form, it can be given a label, it can be named. And if something is given a label and named, is conceptualized, it helps it stand out as a form. So that's the basic idea of Namarupa. And then later in Buddhism, it comes to be used almost in a way where Nama means mind, where mind is all the conceptualizing activities and perception, and Rupa is physicality and the body. And in the early Buddhist suttas, the texts that purport to give us the remembered words of the Buddha, at one point he says that consciousness is dependent on Namarupa, and Namarupa is dependent on consciousness, that there's this mutual dependence. It's hard to know exactly what's being said there, but the basic idea would be that whenever there's a moment of awareness, there's always a way in which it's dependent on embodiment and conceptual, perceptual, mental activities. And conversely, where there is the living body and conceptual, perceptual activities, there is also awareness. And that's very much you could say it's a theme for my book, in that I try to always hold these two things together: consciousness as awareness and our embodiment, our embodied being.
What is your understanding of the middle way, Evan, and how does that relate to what we've been talking about today?
Well, I suppose there's the middle way as a Buddhist, specifically Buddhist concept, philosophical concept, and then there's the middle way as I try to follow it in my own way in the book. In the Buddhist context, philosophically, it's the idea that we should not fall to the extreme of taking things to have a substantial reality that they don't and can't have because they're conditioned and impermanent and they're processes, not things. And another extreme which says, well, they don't really exist, it's all illusions or nothing, because they're not really substantially existent. So the middle way is this idea of neither a kind of absolutism or a kind of nihilism. And in my book, the way that that's a guiding thread for me in my book, say, for example, with regard to the self, is precisely this idea that the self isn't a thing, an entity that has a substantial reality. It's a process, and it's a process under constant construction. And precisely because it's a process, it's not a nothing. It's not an illusion. It's not just a mirage. So that's very much the middle way framework of my book. With regard to consciousness and this question about the relationship of consciousness to our embodiment, or to the brain and the body sort of seen from a scientific perspective, the middle way there for me is a matter of not being reductionist materialists, where we say everything is reducible to the brain, so we can understand consciousness entirely in terms of the brain. That would be one extreme. Another extreme would be to say, well, consciousness is a transcendent spiritual reality that goes beyond the brain. And it seems to me that we're not in a position, if we're honest, to be able to say either of those things, that whenever we examine consciousness, it always shows up in some context of embodiment. So that's the Namarupa idea. But we're not able to understand consciousness by treating it just as a brain process, because as philosophers, Western philosophers especially, have emphasized in recent years, there is an explanatory gap when we try to do that, that we don't we can say consciousness is contingent on the brain, it's dependent on the brain, it's correlated with what's going on in the brain, but we don't have any theory or explanatory framework that enables us to see how consciousness could be nothing but a brain process, in the sense that we could, just talking in the language of neuroscience, explain the presence of consciousness in the world. There's a deep conceptual gap there that we're not able to bridge. So my own view is that we shouldn't be reductionists, but we shouldn't be spiritualists either. We need a middle way that emphasizes the kind of irreducible importance of embodiment and the irreducible importance of experience, that our understanding of consciousness in the end is through what philosophers call phenomenology, through an appreciation of our experience. And so that's very much the framework also for the book and for how I discuss and examine consciousness.
Okay. And what would you say is your greatest hope for the book?
Oh, that's a nice question. Greatest hope for the book. I would say that my greatest hope is not to convince anyone of any particular idea or argument or proposition or thesis, but rather to illustrate that it's possible to relate the world's contemplative traditions and science in a way that changes both of them, and that can create a new kind of self-knowledge for ourselves, one that I think we really need in our contemporary culture, where, let's say, old forms of religion we no longer find satisfying, but scientific materialism is also unsatisfying. So that would be my hope, is that it could help people to see the need for a new kind of self-knowledge and give them some of the materials for creating that. And also, more generally, in the case of the descriptions that I give of, let's say, my own dream experiences, my own meditative experiences, that people can see that philosophy isn't an abstract enterprise, but that it comes out of personal experience, and that there may be ideas in the book that can help people relate to their own experience in productive ways. Those would be my hopes for the book.
Great. And my last question, Evan, if people wanted to find out more about your work, how would they go about it?
Well, beyond reading the book Waking, Dreaming, Being, there's a website I have, evanthompson.me, where I have a lot of my papers for audiences who are interested in more kind of technical, philosophical, scientific things. I've also started writing a blog at the Psychology Today magazine blogs website. So if people want to follow me in more kind of accessible writings, that would be a good place. That would be a good place to look.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for talking to me today, Evan. It's been fascinating and a real pleasure.
Thanks very much. I've enjoyed it, and thanks for the opportunity to do so.
You can find out more about Middle Way philosophy at www.middlewaysociety.org.